Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Calider ball python, or some people would pronounce it the Calider. The Calider actually consists of two genes, the Calico and the spider, and it makes for a really visually impressive ball python. As a matter of fact, it's probably one of the most visually stunning snakes with just two genes in the mix, and you can actually mix quite a few other genes into it and make some really breathtaking ball python combinations, and they start relatively inexpensive and they're really popular. I can almost guarantee at your local reptile show you will see some Caliders for sale. So in this video I want to jump over to the internet and I want to show you the potential of the Calider ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and now I want to start with the Calico ball python. This is what a Calico looks like. This is one component of the Calider. And when it comes to making really high quality Caliders, it really depends on the quality of your Calico and the quality of your spider. And essentially what the Calico does is it brings up a lot of white on the sides of the ball python. And you can actually see on this one it has a little bit of white coming up the sides. I've actually seen some Calicos with just a couple flecks of just little specks of white down on the bottom, and I've actually seen some Calicos that are super white, almost more than 50% coming up the sides of the snake. And here is what the spider looks like, and this is the spider, and the spider almost looks like it has Calico in the mix. It's a really visually stunning ball python, and a lot of people ask me, hey, what are the genes in the spider? And it almost looks like it has Calico and Enchi and maybe Pastel and all these genes. As a matter of fact, the spider is just one dominant gene. So you breed it to something else and half the offspring come out as spiders. And when it comes to spiders, I've actually produced some here in my collection, and the amount of white on the side of the spider is really variable, similar to the Calico. I've actually produced a clutch of spiders, and in the same clutch I've actually got some really high white spiders where the white is coming up the sides quite a bit, and I've actually got some really low white spiders where you almost can't see any white coming up on the spider. And here's what happens if you mix the Calico with the spider. You actually get a Calider. And take a look at this crazy snake. This is probably one of the most visually impressive combos with just two genes in ball pythons. Pretty amazing. And if you actually look at some of the Caliders over here on Morphmarket, you'll actually see some that don't look like this. You'll see some low white ones. As a matter of fact, I've actually seen some spiders over here where people list them as spiders possible Calico because they aren't 100% sure that Calico is actually in the mix. You can actually have a really low white Calico and a low white spider and still get a really low white Calider. But if you actually bring them together and you pop something like this out, you definitely know that you have a Calider. So I want to work some other genes into the Calider so you can see the ultimate potential of working other genes into the mix. And I want to start with the Pastel ball python. This is what the Pastel looks like. And the Pastel is a codominant mutation. And essentially what it is, it's a yellow gene, and it brings out a lot of yellow in the snakes and then the combos. And what it really does is it reduces the pattern in a lot of cases. You actually see, like on normal ball pythons, you'll see a lot of like the Roswell gray alien heads, and it really reduces those, and it's kind of unpredictable as far as kind of the patterns that you'll see. Sometimes you'll see almost thin stripes on your Pastels, and sometimes it'll just barely reduce the patterns. Sometimes it'll hardly touch the patterns at all with Pastels. And this is what happens if you work Pastel in with a Calider. And take a look at this. You actually get what is known as a Calibi, and this thing is screaming. As a matter of fact, if I went to a reptile show and I actually saw this at a table, I would be tempted to actually buy this snake. This is crazy. And kind of the interesting thing about this, I thought this was kind of a unique name for this combo, the Calibi, because a lot of times over here on Morphmarket, when we talk about the B at the end of kind of a slang name, a lot of times the B stands for spider. So the kind of a, you know, when I first saw this, I was like, hey, wait a minute, is this really a Calibi? Because the Calibi I would think would be the Calico and the spider. But if you actually come over here and type in Calibi into Morphmarket, it actually breaks it up into three genes: the spider, the Pastel, and the Calico. So here is the Super Pastel. So this actually has 2 copies of the Pastel gene. And when you actually have 2 copies, you get a snake that's a little bit brighter than just the Pastel, and it really jumbles up the pattern a lot more versus just 1 copy of the gene. And a lot of times you can actually see the highlights in the back of the snake and a lighter, kind of a faded out head in the Super Pastel compared to just 1 copy of the Pastel. So here's what happens if you mix the Super Pastel in with the Calider. You get a killer bee calico, and take a look at this crazy snake. And this almost looks like the last version, except you notice on this one the pattern is really scrambled up, coming from the Super Pastel that really scrambles up the pattern. As a matter of fact, if you go back and look at the last one, this is the Caliber, and in the Caliber, with just 1 copy of the Pastel, you can see it really still keeps the spider pattern on top of the snake, versus the killer bee calico it gets a little confusing. You can actually name this, it's like a Super Pastel Calider. There's a lot of different names you can actually name these ball pythons. So the killer bee is actually a Super Pastel and the spider. So we're actually kind of separating the first part of the name from the calico. That is the killer bee. You could also call it the Super Pastel Calider, or as some people call it, the Super Pastel Calider. A lot of people call them Caliders instead of Caliders, but that is a really pretty amazing snake. As a matter of fact, you look at the price on this one, this is $500. That is really awesome. Sold in 2017. So this is the banana ball python. The banana is kind of a unique gene. As a matter of fact, when it first came out, a lot of people were thinking the banana was just another albino, until they realized it was a co-dominant morph instead of recessive like the other albinos. And when they first came out, they were selling for tens of thousands of dollars. Now you can pick up bananas for just a couple $100s. It's amazing how the prices have really come down on bananas. And here's what happens if you mix banana in with the Calider. Take a look at this beauty. This is amazing. Essentially what it does is it really brings in a lot of the yellow, almost keeps the same appearance of the Calider, and just changes it to a yellow color, which is kind of surprising for banana, because a lot of times the banana is really visually dominant, and sometimes it really dominates the pattern as well. So in this case, I was really surprised to actually see the spider pattern coming through on the top of the snake with the addition of the banana. It makes for a really impressive combo. As a matter of fact, you can tell this one may have a little bit of age on it, because you can actually see little spots coming in on the snake. Usually the bananas start out with a lot of oranges and purples when they're a little bit younger, and then it kind of transforms into kind of like a two-tone yellow with a lot of these little freckles over it. And as a matter of fact, you might be able to see, yeah, this one is 292 grams. And when ball pythons hatch out, they're usually about, like 100, 70 to 100 grams, somewhere in that range. And then once they start hitting about 200, 300 grams, they start transforming. These bananas can really transform from when they're just hatched to just a few months later. So I thought this was kind of an interesting combo. This is actually the same snake as the last one, except with the addition of yellow belly. And yellow belly in a lot of cases will bring out a lot of oranges and yellows. And in this case, it really makes this snake shine. It's kind of interesting. It still has these little spots from the banana, and you can kind of see that the spots almost are going on the white, which is kind of unusual, that it's actually kind of moving away from the yellow color. And then the yellow belly is really bringing out a lot of the kind of the orangish color of the snake. Makes for a really amazing combo. So here is the lesser ball python. The lesser is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. So if you breed 2 lessers together, you actually will get an all-white snake with blue eyes, which is really amazing. Probably one of the most popular snakes that I've ever produced is the blue-eyed leucistics. People come up to my table at the reptile show and they're like, hey, I want to hold the white snake. We don't want to buy it. We just want to hold it because it's so awesome. And here's what happens if you mix lesser in with a Calider. You get a spider lesser Calico, and just take a look at this beauty. And it's pretty amazing. The more I look into these colliders, it seems like everything you work into it makes for a really visually stunning snake. You know, sometimes some of these combos work well with some genes and not the other, and then it seems like almost everything that I look at working it into this combination makes for a really impressive snake. And the really cool thing about this too is if you actually take this snake and you breed it to like a normal ball python, you can actually reproduce the lesser Calico spider. As a matter of fact, I actually pulled it up over here on the ball python genetic calculator. You come over to your Morphmarket and you can actually plug in your combinations. Now, I've actually had quite a few people in the comments section, you know, asking me, hey, what happens if I actually breed these snakes together? And I kind of always direct them over here to these genetic calculators, because you can just plug it in. You can see all the combinations and you can see all the odds. And you can actually see, in this case, you actually get a 1 out of 8 chance to reproduce that parent if you're actually working with a 3 gene combination. So if you actually took like a lesser Calider and you bred it to a normal, I'd say maybe 1 snake out of 8 would actually be the reproduction of the parent. So here is an albino ball python. This gets a little bit trickier because the albino is a recessive mutation. So essentially you need 2 copies of the albino gene to actually get a visual. So if you're actually working this into a Calider, you're actually looking at a 4 gene combo, which is, if they actually try to reproduce it, you actually have to have, the other kind of tough thing with the albino is you actually have to breed 2 heads together or 2 visuals together to actually reproduce the albino. It's not like you can just breed an albino to something and reproduce the albino. So that's one of the limitations of a recessive mutation. But if you actually work the albino into the Calider, take a look at this crazy snake. This is really awesome too. You can actually see the colors are completely reversed. So instead of, you know, the dark kind of a spider pattern up on top, you actually get this crazy white kind of a spider pattern coming up the top with white coming up the belly. And of course, all albinos always have the bright red eyes. So here is an Enchi. The Enchi works really well with the Calider. The Enchi essentially reduces the pattern of the ball python. A lot of times the Enchi will also bring out a lot of yellows and oranges in a lot of combinations. And you can definitely see, and really, kind of the hard thing about this whole project is a lot of these genes are really variable, especially the Enchi. So a lot of times an Enchi can be really super reducing. I'd say this is kind of one of the more extreme versions of an Enchi. Sometimes the Enchi's you almost can't tell that they're Enchis. So you have the variable Enchi, the variable spider with variable amounts of white on the spider, and then you also have the variable Calico that can be a high white Calico or a low white Calico. So you're kind of playing the odds not only with the genetics and the possibilities, but with the quality and the amounts of the different amounts of Enchi and the amounts of white on the spider and the Calico. But here's what happens if you actually mix the Enchi in with the Calider. You actually get this crazy snake. Take a look at this beauty. Essentially what it does is it takes the Calider and it really reduces the pattern up on the top of the snake. Instead of the spider web pattern on top, it reduces it into these little tiny splotches up on the top of the snake. Makes for a really impressive combo. So here is the Pinstripe. If you actually work the Pinstripe into the Calider, you can definitely see the Pinstripe in the mix. The Pinstripe is probably one of my favorite genes. It's probably the brightest gold base gene that you can actually get in ball pythons. It's actually a dominant mutation, so if you breed a Pinstripe to something else, half the offspring come out as Pinstripe. And if you actually work this into the Calider, you get this crazy snake. Take a look at this one. This is really awesome because it really keeps the gold of the Pinstripe, which is really pretty awesome. A lot of times in a lot of Pinstripe combinations, a lot of times it'll reduce the amount of gold or eliminate it altogether. But in this case, you can definitely see the gold of the Pinstripe really shining through. And as a matter of fact, this actually has a few more genes, few more possible genes in the mix. So if you take a look at this one, this is a spinner, which is the spider and the Pinstripe, and then it has the Enchi and the Calico. So it also has the enchi in there, so it's kind of reducing the pattern a little bit. It also has yellow belly and orange dream. So the yellow belly and the orange dream, a lot of times when you mix them together, it really brings out the oranges and yellows, can make for some really bright snakes. And if you actually look at the kind of the color on this one, it has almost the orangish yellow sheen on it. It could have the yellow belly and the orange dream in the mix. It's pretty awesome snake. So speaking of orange dream and yellow belly, I wanted to pull up a couple other examples here right at the end. This is actually an orange dream yellow belly collider. So you actually have, it's essentially the collider with the orange dream and yellow belly, and it's really hard to tell in this picture. I think the contrast and the brightness isn't really showing the true potential of what the snake actually looks like. But usually when you mix orange dream and yellow belly together, you can actually get a really bright yellow, almost an orange bright yellow snake. And orange dream can be really variable as well. You know, you have all these genes with all this variability. There's like a high intensity orange dream, which really sells for a lot more money than the low intensity, like 10 times as much money, usually with the really high intensity orange dream. So sometimes, you know, you can get a lot of these combos that have the same exact genes and you have completely different visual appearances of what you're actually seeing in the snake. So here's another one that's pretty awesome. This is actually the collider with the pastel and the yellow belly. So the pastel, the yellow belly, and the orange dream. If you actually mix those together, you probably get some of the brightest, most flashy snakes that you can get in ball pythons. And this one with the pastel and the yellow belly, you can see it really brings out a lot of the yellow, makes for a really amazing combo. And there's just one more I kind of wanted to show you over here. Take a look at this one. This one just blew me away. And it's kind of interesting. You have all these variations of a theme. And then sometimes within ball pythons, you actually have kind of a genetic anomaly when you're mixing these snakes together and you pop out something like this and then you're scratching your head, what in the world did I just produce? What is that snake? And this is kind of a weird kind of anomaly where all these genes are working together. As a matter of fact, if you handed me this snake, I don't think I could even pick out one gene in this snake. This is crazy. This is actually the spider, the pinstripe, the enchi, the lesser, and the calico. And somehow all these genes are just working together to make this really crazy looking ball python. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Shane Carter asks, I'd like to retire from my daytime job and just breed reptiles. Can I actually pay the bills just breeding snakes? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, I was asking myself the same question when I left my day job, and I'd say probably the biggest struggle when starting your own business is actually leaving the security of a regular paycheck and the health insurance and all the benefits and everything and jumping out into your own business, which is really risky. You know, they say, you know, 9 out of 10 businesses actually fail within the first few years. You have to be really, I'd say, savvy when it comes to starting your own business. You can actually do it. And kind of the advantage I have here working in my house, I actually started breeding here in my basement instead of starting up a whole entire breeding facility. So I don't have the rent, I don't have the employees, I don't have a lot of the overhead that a lot of people actually have if they actually jump into it full time. I've actually seen some people, they just buy a whole warehouse and then they spend like $1 million on snakes and they hire all these employees. And let me tell you, you can sink really quick if you have all those expenses, especially if you're not actually producing your hatchlings, which you're really relying on. And kind of the key that I have, you know, for my whole business as far as the reptiles is I diversify my income. So I kind of think of creative ways, how can I make money other than just the sale of my ball python hatchlings? So kind of one of my biggest things that I'm working on now is my YouTube videos. So you can actually make YouTube videos, and eventually it's kind of hard with YouTube because you start at zero and you're making no money at all until you make hundreds of videos and you're at it for years and years. But eventually you can get to a point where you're actually making more money on YouTube than what you're actually making in the sale of your snakes. And that's kind of my ultimate goal, is to have YouTube keep going. And that way I have more of a security blanket. So for example, if something happens, hopefully nothing will ever happen, like the building burns down and I lose all my animals or something really tragic happens, I actually still have that YouTube income coming in, which could actually help me rebuild my reptile business, kind of a security blanket. The other thing you can actually do is you can like resell your coconut husk bedding that you use for your reptiles as landscaping material. I actually recoup almost all of my cost for, you know, reselling my bedding as landscaping materials. There's a lot of things you can do. You can actually take a small rack of rodents and raise them as like a pet quality rodent and sell pet rodents, and you can make pretty good money just selling the pet rodents. And there's all these different ways you can actually make money, kind of funneling all these different sources of income into your business, versus if you only rely on the hatchlings and you have a really bad year. And as a matter of fact, I'm kind of having a bad year this year. Normally I have, you know, 10 to 12 clutches of eggs, and it looks like I may only have 5 or 6. A lot of my females are going back on food. So if I was actually relying 100% on my hatchlings, I could be in some serious trouble if I didn't have all these other revenue streams coming in. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.